The moment I opened that door and saw what was standing on the landing, I understood, in the space of about 3 seconds, that the last 6 months of my life had been built on something that didn't exist. Not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, a deliberate, carefully constructed lie. And the worst part? I was 55 years old. I was supposed to be done with this kind of shock. I was supposed to be past the age where a man could make your blood go cold just by showing you who he really was. But here I was, standing in the doorway of my own apartment, in my own building, in the little rural town of Harwick, Missouri, population maybe 4,000, if you counted the people out on the county roads, and I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My heart was doing something it hadn't done since I was a paramedic on a bad call, the kind where you already know before you open the ambulance doors. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without the before. I spent 34 years married to Dale Mercer. 34 years. I was 21 when I said those vows in the First Baptist Church on Caldwell Street, wearing a dress my mother had altered twice because I kept losing weight from nerves. Dale was 24. He had a good smile and steady hands, and he told me he loved me like I was the only solid thing in his life. I believed every word. We built a life in Harwick the way people do in small towns, slowly, practically, without much drama. I went through paramedic certification while working the overnight dispatch at the county EMS station, then eventually moved up to full field duty. I liked the work. More than liked it, I needed it. There's something about being the person who shows up when everything has gone wrong that makes you feel useful in a way nothing else does. I was good at staying calm, good at reading a situation fast and acting on what I saw, not what I hoped. Dale worked in agricultural equipment sales. He wasn't rich, but he was consistent. We had a house on Birchwood Lane with a covered porch and a garden I never had enough time for. We had a cat named Sergeant, a big gray Tom who'd showed up on the porch in 2009 as a scrawny stray and decided to stay. By the time all of this happened, Sergeant was 15 years old, mostly deaf, and spent his days parked in a square of sunlight on the kitchen floor like a furry throw rug. I loved that animal unreasonably. He'd been with me through the hard years, and there had been hard years. The marriage started fraying somewhere around year 20. Not dramatically. No affair discovered, no screaming fight that ended everything cleanly. Just a slow withdrawal, like a tide going out so gradually you don't notice until you're standing on mud. Dale started spending more time driving out to see clients in neighboring counties. He started having opinions about money that didn't match mine. He started talking about retirement in ways that made me feel like I was a variable in his plan, not a partner in it. I tried. I want to be honest about that. I tried for a long time. Couples counseling twice. Both times Dale quit after 4 sessions. Long conversations at the kitchen table that ended with him saying, "You're overthinking it, Norma," and going to bed. I kept working my shifts, kept coming home to Sergeant and the house on Birchwood Lane, kept telling myself this was just what long marriages looked like after the kids were grown. Our daughter, Cassie, had moved to Kansas City by then. She was 30 by the time the divorce finally happened, working as a physical therapist, living her own life. She'd seen the distance between Dale and me for years. She wasn't surprised when I called her. The divorce was finalized in the fall of 2 years ago. It was not amicable. Dale had opinions about the house, about my pension, about a savings account I'd opened in my own name after my mother passed, and left me some money. He hired an attorney from Springfield who made the whole process feel like a deposition. I hired my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss out of Joplin, and we got through it. I kept the house for 6 months, then sold it because I couldn't stand being in those rooms anymore. I moved into an apartment on the 2nd floor of a building on Maple Court, clean, small, manageable. 2 bedrooms, which felt extravagant, but the rent was reasonable. Sergeant came with me, obviously. He adjusted better than I did. That was April, 2 years ago, the first warm days after a brutal Missouri winter. I remember carrying boxes up the stairs while the maple trees on the street were just starting to bud out, that pale yellow-green that only lasts about a week. I remember setting Sergeant's food bowl in the corner of the new kitchen and thinking, Okay, this is the rest of it. Let's see what it looks like. I wasn't looking for anyone. I wasn't on apps or websites. I wasn't talking to my coworkers about dating. I was 53 years old, newly divorced after 34 years, and the last thing I wanted was another person's complexity in my life. I had Sargent. I had my shifts. I had Patricia Voss's final invoice paid off, and a credit score that had survived the divorce intact. I was fine. Garrett Holloway walked into my life through the Harwick Volunteer Fire Department's spring fundraiser dinner, which I attended because my partner on the ambulance, a woman named Deb Kastner, bought 2 tickets and didn't want to go alone. Garrett was a friend of the fire chief, something to do with construction contracting, a big, quiet man in his early 60s, with silver at his temples, and the kind of manners that feel genuine rather than performed. He held the door. He remembered my name the second time we met. He asked about my work with actual curiosity, not the vague nodding men do when they're waiting for their turn to talk. We started seeing each other that same April, the first warm days, the maple buds, all of it. It felt, honestly, like the universe being unexpectedly kind. He was a widower, he said. His wife had passed 4 years earlier from pancreatic cancer. He'd been on his own since then, living in a rental house on the edge of town while he figured out his next chapter. He had a grown son in Colorado he talked about with obvious pride. He was calm and steady, and he made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years. 6 months in, Garrett told me he loved me. We were sitting at my kitchen table drinking tea, actual loose-leaf tea from a little shop in Joplin, something I'd picked up as a post-divorce ritual, and he said it so simply, like it was just a fact he was reporting. I said it back because it was true. Sargent walked across his feet, and he reached down and scratched the old cat behind the ears without making a thing of it, and I thought, this is real. By March of this year, about 11 months into us, Garrett started talking about the future in concrete terms. Moving in together. Eventually. Maybe something more formal, he said carefully, watching my face. I told him I wasn't in a rush. He said he wasn't either. But the conversations kept happening, and they kept feeling good. And somewhere in there I started thinking maybe the rest of it didn't have to look the way I'd imagined. Then came the afternoon in the first week of April, the maples budding again, the ground finally soft after another long winter, a strange circularity to it, when Garrett came over for tea. He'd been a little distracted for a few days, something I'd noticed but hadn't pressed on. He was allowed his moods. I was in the kitchen setting out cups when I heard his phone buzz on the table. He glanced at it and his whole posture shifted. "Mom's here," he said. He said it with this bright, easy smile, the smile I'd come to trust. "Go let the lady of the house in." I looked at him for a second. He'd mentioned his mother before, Vivian, lived about 40 minutes away in Carthage, in her mid-80s, sharp as a tack, he always said. He'd talked about wanting me to meet her. I'd said, sure, of course, whenever you're ready. But this felt sudden, unannounced. "She just showed up?" I said. "I may have mentioned you'd be making tea." He gave me a slightly sheepish look. "She doesn't do well with being asked permission. You'll love her." I set down the kettle. I smoothed my shirt. I walked down the short hallway toward the front door, already composing the version of myself I'd present, the calm, competent version, the one that handled emergencies without flinching. Sargent lifted his head from his spot on the floor and watched me go. I opened the door, and what I saw on that landing made every bit of that composure dissolve. It wasn't an elderly woman in her mid-80s. It wasn't Vivian from Carthage, whoever Vivian was. Standing in the hallway outside my apartment, holding a casserole dish covered in foil, was a woman about my age, maybe a year or two younger. She had a short brown haircut and was wearing a barn jacket and mud boots like she'd directed in from somewhere rural. She had the look of someone who owned things, land, opinions, the right to be wherever she was standing, and she was looking at me with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. Not surprise, not curiosity, not the polite nervousness of a first meeting. She was looking at me the way you look at something that's in your way. "You must be the girlfriend," she said, not unkindly, but with a very specific weight on the word girlfriend, the way you'd say it about something temporary. My mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I'm Diane," she said. She shifted the casserole dish to one arm and held out her free hand. "Garrett's wife." The hallway tilted. Or maybe I did. I heard Garrett's chair scrape back from the kitchen table behind me, heard him say my name in a voice that had gone careful and low. Sargent padded into the hallway and sat down next to my feet, as if he'd decided to stay close. The foil on the casserole dish crinkled in the draft from the stairwell. 34 years of marriage had taught me to stay functional when the world dropped out from under me. Paramedic training had reinforced it. But nothing, not one shift, not one bad call, not one courthouse hallway during the divorce, had prepared me for the particular cold that settled into my chest right then. Garrett's wife. Not his late wife, not a past he'd buried. His wife, present tense, standing in my doorway with dinner. I looked at her hand, still extended. I looked at the casserole dish. I looked at the mud on her boots. And then I did the only thing a woman with 30 years of keeping her head does in a moment like that. I stepped back and let her in. She walked into my apartment like she'd walked into places that belonged to other people before. Not rude about it, that was the thing. She set the casserole dish on my kitchen counter without being invited to, looked around at my space with calm, assessing eyes, and said, "You've done nice things with this layout. These old buildings can be tricky." I stood there in my own hallway and watched her do it. Garrett had gotten up from the table. He was standing near the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets, and I recognized the posture. It was the posture of a man who has been caught and is now waiting to see which way the damage falls. I'd seen it before. Not on Garrett, on Dale, twice, over smaller things. There's a particular stillness men get when they've been managing two versions of their life, and the wall between them just came down. "Garrett," I said. My voice came out level. 30 years of paramedic work will do that for you. The voice goes calm exactly when the situation goes critical. He looked at me. "Would you like to explain what's happening right now?" I said. "Or would you like me to ask Diane?" Diane had turned from the counter. She was watching us both with an expression that had shifted, less certain than it had been in the doorway. Something had registered for her in the way I spoke, in the way I was standing. She wasn't afraid of me, but she was recalibrating. "Garrett," she said, and her voice had an edge that I recognized too. That was a woman who had said his name that way many times before. That was a specific kind of marital sharpness, worn smooth from use. He exhaled. He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down, which struck me as an almost absurd response to the situation. But men do strange things when they're cornered. "We're separated," he said. "Diane and I. We have been for 2 years." "Legally separated?" I asked. A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Working toward it," he said. I looked at Diane. "We are not separated," she said. She said it quietly, not dramatically, like she was correcting a math error. "We have a house. We have a joint account. His truck is on my insurance. We had dinner together on Easter Sunday." She picked up her casserole dish from my counter with both hands. "He told me he was coming to Harwick to check on a job site. He does that. I followed him this time because I'd been finding receipts." The kitchen was very quiet. Sargent had come in at some point and was sitting next to the refrigerator, watching all three of us with the flat, interested expression of an elderly cat who has seen plenty of human behavior and is not impressed. "Receipts," I said. "Tea from a shop in Joplin," Diane said. 2 cups, twice. Dinner at Clarkson's on Route 7. A hardware store in Harwick, which, fine, could be the job site. But the tea kept showing up. I thought about the little tin of loose leaf I'd bought as a post-divorce ritual. I thought about how Garrett had called it charming. I thought about 11 months of Saturday afternoons, and the way he'd said "I love you" like it was just a fact he was reporting. "I need you both to leave," I said. Diane nodded, once. She seemed almost relieved, or at least no longer surprised. She picked up her dish and walked toward the door. She had gotten what she came for, which was confirmation. She'd driven 40 minutes from Carthage, or wherever they actually lived together, and she had her confirmation. Garrett stood up. "Norma." "Don't," I said. "It's more complicated than—" "Garrett." I said it the way Diane had said it. I watched him register that. "I am 55 years old. I was a paramedic for 26 years. I have seen people die because someone didn't tell the truth fast enough. I have zero interest in complicated. Get out of my apartment." He got out. I stood in my kitchen after the door closed, and I listened to their footsteps go down the stairs, his heavier, hers quicker, and then the outside door of the building open and shut. I stood there until I couldn't hear anything except the refrigerator hum and Sargent making a small, inquiring sound near my ankles. I picked him up. He was old and heavy, and he draped over my arm like he always had. I stood at the kitchen window and watched Garrett's truck pull out of the lot, and then a silver sedan I didn't recognize, Diane's presumably, follow it out toward the main road. The tea was still steeping on the counter. I poured it out. I called Deb Kastner that evening. Deb had been my partner on the ambulance for 9 years, and she was the person who had gotten me to that fundraiser dinner in the first place, so I figured she had an obligation to listen. She listened. She said several things about Garrett that I won't repeat here, but that I agreed with completely. "Did you know?" I asked her. "Did anyone know?" "Nobody knew," she said. "Norma, I swear to God, if I'd known I'd have told you day one." I believed her. Harwick is 4,000 people. If there had been talk, I'd have heard it, or Deb would have. Garrett had been careful. He'd kept his story clean, widower, grown son in Colorado, renting on the edge of town. The rental house was probably real. The son in Colorado was probably real. The wife he'd buried 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer was, evidently, alive and driving a silver sedan and making casseroles. What he'd done was thread the needle on a small enough community that no one had the full picture. His life in, wherever he and Diane actually lived, was separate enough from Harwick that the two worlds hadn't touched. Until she followed the receipts. I spent about a week being angry in the particular quiet way I'd learned over 34 years of not making scenes. I went to my shifts. I came home to Sargent. I did not cry about Garrett Holloway, which surprised me a little, and then didn't surprise me at all. I'd used up my crying on Dale, on the divorce, on the house on Birchwood Lane. What I felt about Garrett was colder than grief. It was the feeling of finding a load-bearing wall that turned out to be hollow. Structural disappointment. On the 8th day, I called Patricia Voss in Joplin. Not because I needed a divorce attorney. I'd never been married to the man, thank God. But Patricia was sharp, and she knew people, and I wanted to know if there was anything useful I could do with the information I had. I didn't want revenge, exactly. I wanted the situation to have a shape I could understand. Patricia asked me a few questions. She made a couple of calls. She came back to me 2 days later with something I hadn't expected. Garrett Holloway had a contractor's license in Missouri. He'd had a complaint filed against him 18 months ago by a homeowner in Newton County. Shoddy foundation work, significant dollar amount, never fully resolved. The homeowner had gotten a partial settlement and then given up. Patricia knew the homeowner's attorney. It was a small world. "What do you want to do with that?" Patricia asked me. "Nothing illegal," I said. "Wasn't suggesting anything illegal," she said, and I could hear her smiling. "But the licensing board takes complaints, and a second complaint, from an unrelated party, tends to make the first one look less like a misunderstanding. I didn't have a complaint to file about his contracting work. I'd never hired him for anything. But I knew people in Harwick who were thinking about it. There'd been talk at the fire department fundraiser, the reason we'd met in the first place. People who needed foundation work, renovation work, the kind of jobs Garrett made his living on. I made 2 phone calls, just informational, just sharing what I'd learned through Patricia about the Newton County situation, which was a matter of record. I didn't editorialize. I didn't mention Diane or the casserole dish or any of it. I simply let people know that there was a prior complaint worth looking into before signing any contracts. I don't know exactly what happened after that. I know Garrett didn't get the job he'd been angling for through the fire chief. I know the fire chief called me about 3 weeks later and asked, carefully, if everything was all right, and I told him no, actually. but that I was handling it. He didn't ask more. Small towns have a way of filling in the blanks without needing the whole story out loud. What I know for certain is that 6 weeks after Diane walked into my apartment with her casserole dish, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. You didn't deserve that. Neither did I." I sat with that for a while. Then I typed back, "I hope you're okay. I mean that." She didn't respond, and I didn't expect her to. We weren't going to be friends. We weren't going to have coffee and commiserate over what Garrett Holloway had done to both of us. But something in that exchange felt necessary, like closing a window before a storm. Sargent died in June. He went the way old cats go when they're ready. He found a spot under the bathroom radiator one evening, and by morning he was still. He was 15 years old. He'd been with me through the end of the marriage, through the move, through the divorce being finalized, through Garrett. He'd been sitting next to my feet in that hallway when Diane said those 2 words, his wife, and I will always be a little grateful for that, for the warmth of him there. I had him cremated. I put the small box on the windowsill in the second bedroom where he used to sleep in the sun. I didn't get another cat, not right away. The apartment needed to be quiet for a while. Cassie drove up from Kansas City in July. She spent 4 days, and we didn't talk about Garrett much. She'd heard the version that mattered and had her own opinions, which she kept mostly to herself, which is one of the things I've always loved about her. We drove out to the lake one afternoon and sat on the bank and didn't say much, and that was enough. I am 55 years old. I live in a clean apartment on Maple Court in Harwick, Missouri. I work my shifts. I drink loose-leaf tea from the shop in Joplin, because I'm not going to let a lying man ruin a good ritual. I have learned, again, and maybe this time it will stick, that calm is not the same as safe, that a man who holds the door and remembers your name and asks about your work with genuine interest can still be building a careful, selfish fiction around you. That I am good at reading a situation fast, yes, but only when I let myself see what's actually there, and not what I've decided I'd like it to be. The maples on the street are full and green now. In a few months they'll turn, and then they'll drop, and then there will be another winter, and then another April, and the buds will come back the way they always do, that pale yellow-green that only lasts about a week. I'm not waiting for anything. That's the difference between now and 2 years ago, when I carried those boxes up the stairs and told myself, okay, let's see what the rest of it looks like. I've stopped waiting to see. I already know. The rest of it looks like this. And this is enough.